The spleen is part of the lymphatic system, and it is actually the largest lymphoid organ in the body. So if we look at the location of the spleen, and we only have one of these, we can see that it is found next to the stomach, and it is also found on the left side of the body. It's underneath the diaphragm, so it is in the abdominal cavity. When we look at the function of the spleen, it is a little bit different than all of the other lymphatic tissues that we see, and that is that it actually filters blood. So if we look at the structure, you can see that the spleen has a splenic artery and a splenic vein, so it is highly vascularized. Blood is being transported into the spleen, and what we have then is filtration of the blood. And one thing that's very interesting about this filtration is that it actually removes old and damaged red blood cells. Red blood cells have a relatively short lifespan in our bodies, and so of 120 days. And so they actually need to be broken down and recycled. And that is one of the functions of the spleen. We also have in the spleen white blood cells. So we have macrophages as well as lymphocytes. And so anything that bacteria or viruses that are in the blood can also be filtered out at that time. So we will say that the spleen functions to filter the blood, has many functions, but that's its primary function. So we have the removal and recycling of old and damaged red blood cells and actually platelets as well. Now, platelets are actually pieces of white blood cells that are super important in clotting. So the other thing that the spleen does, it actually functions to store blood and to store platelets. So two, stores blood and platelets. An interesting side note is that organisms that dive, like seals, and dive and are underwater for a long period of time, have very enlarged spleens because they store oxygenated blood there. And when the body needs it, like their brain needs it, it can take that blood that is stored in the spleen and put it into the circulatory system. So we also see that the spleen can also be important in the removal microorganisms and other pathogens, for example. So if we look at the structure of the spleen in a little bit more detail, you'll notice that it actually has a very thin capsule. This is connective tissue. And this actually makes this organ, interestingly, very fragile. And so sometimes when if a person is in a car accident, for example, they can damage their spleen. And what happens is that the blood that is in the spleen then just goes into the body cavity, and that can be life-threatening. So when your spleen is ruptured because of an accident or a traumatic injury, you could also have different things that can cause the rupturing of the spleen, different diseases, and that can be very bad. In the past, we thought that the spleen wasn't really all that necessary, and so oftentimes it was removed, and it was called a splenectomy. And so people have their spleen removed. And interestingly, most of the functions of the spleen can be taken over by other structures in our body. So that's a good thing. So, however, they don't tend to remove it as often as they have done in the past. And one interesting note is that the spleen has some regenerative properties. And that means that, say, for example, in a child, you can just leave a little piece of the spleen if you have to remove most of it, and it will regenerate into an entirely new spleen. So that is a really cool attribute that we see in the spleen. We'll also notice that there is histologically, which if we look at the tissues, there's the difference between the white pulp and the red pulp. So the red pulp has the red blood cells. It also has macrophages that are filtering the red blood cells and removing them. And then the white pulp contains the lymphocytes, the white blood cells like B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. And those are important in detecting microbes and then producing in response to those microbes things like antibodies. And so we see that the spleen is interconnected with our immune system.